Welcome to European Feudalism. During this presentation, myself and the rest of my group would like to share with you some distinguishing characteristics of the Middle Ages. Let's get started. The term feudalism derives from the Latin feodum, which we recognize as fief, which was a piece of property given from one person to another under agreement that certain services will be performed. The actual definition of what feudalism is and contains in reflection within history is often at debate, with some aspects of different definitions applying in part, but not in whole. For this reason, many historians reject the definition. Loosely, when applied to the idea of European feudalism, it reflects the social conditions of the age. In early Carolingian dynasty, Charles Martel granted nobles and lords fiefs and vassals to build an income and provide for the men in his army. In return for the land, Martel required that the nobles and lords pledge their loyalty to him and his crown. The need for men in the army emerged when invaders, such as the Vikings, Magyars, and the Saracens, attacked and pillaged the towns and villages for riches. The people of the ransacked towns and villages looked for protection from the king. However, the king no longer had enough power or money to protect his subjects since he lost his riches when the raiders invaded his territory. The isolation from other civilizations and nations, as well as chaos from the armed invasions, worked in the favor of strengthening the powers of the aristocracy and their hold on the frightened people. The monarch became a figurehead of the nation. His power weakened as the aristocracy strengthened theirs through the loyalty of the people, the nobles, and lords. Feudalism emerged from the result of the institution of the aristocracy and the manorialism system. Central economic features of the aristocracy provided protection in return for labor from the people. The aristocracy took advantage of the fear the people had from the invaders and exploited their fears by forcing them to cultivate and maintain the land for protection. The aristocracy and vassal developed a mutual relationship, which allowed for feudalism to expand and spread. The people worked the land for homage and protection. The lords gained power and money. The emergence of feudalism allowed for lords to gain power and wealth. In return, they protect themselves and others from invaders who sought riches. One of the more notable features of European feudalism was the social grouping of the culture into the three estates of the realm. The only two individuals within the culture that were not assigned to an estate were the king and the pope. The pope held the moral and religious superiority of the realm and, in some cases, was regarded as being in a position even higher than that of the king. The king, while reliant on his estates, ruled over the nation. The three estates spoken about here do not apply to the women of this society. Their estates were defined around their virtues, whether they were a virgin, married, or a widow. The division of these social classes were rigid, and while it was not impossible, advancement from one estate into the next was uncommon. In essence, the social hierarchy classified not just a man's lot in life, but his role in the society. The first estate of the realm was the church. Much of civilization in Europe during this time was centered around the Roman Catholic Church, headed by the Pope, and attracted the same level of dedication throughout all the castes. They were referred to as the oratores, and their main purpose was to define moral order during the age, and through religious services they often dictated these authorities. Failure to follow the Church's teachings and sacraments would lead to excommunication, a removal from the Church. With the Church's spiritual power also came economic and political. It was the largest landowner in Europe and demanded a tithe of its followers, a tax that demanded 1/10 of a person's wealth, be that money or goods and services. Members of this estate were often the only ones who could read, and the story of Christ was often told through their elaborate artwork, a visible declaration of devotion found within churches, monasteries, and the Gothic cathedrals of the time. The second estate belonged to the nobility, the bellatores. This ranged from knights to lords to even princes. Their role was twofold: to provide protection to the people through military service and to rule over the peasantry. They passed down and enforced the dictations of the church. The social status of nobles in the higher levels of this estate was one of birthright. Their title was granted from their father, while some knights, arguably the lowest members of this estate, could come from common blood. They were generally sons of nobles. For this reason, the Second Estate vastly monopolized the forces of Europe. The greatest concentration of wealth for the state, however, was not in their military presence, but in the land they owned. The use of currency was at a decline. Owning land meant that you had access to natural resources that allowed for hunting, fishing, and mining. Any free man and serfs who resided in his lands owed that noble a percentage of their production. Having possession of land also meant that the noble could give it away for a declaration of fealty from another lord. While the land they governed may have been a grant from the church, the king, or another higher ranking aristocrat, land ownership ultimately meant wealth. Feudalism offered a way for a person to advance himself within society through military service and knighthood. Knights held a place in society above peasants, but they weren't members of the noble ruling class or royalty. Knighthood was a position that had to be earned, so it made for an appealing means for a younger son of a lord to advance himself. A knight could make a fortune either by a granted land from a king or by being a paid professional in service to a lord. Boys who trained to be knights were usually sons of knights or lords. Sons of commoners could also train, but keep in mind that you had to afford your own armor, and that wasn't cheap. Women of the castle took care of them until the age of 7, which was roughly when the age of training began. Then they were moved to the house of another lord or knight, where they were bestowed with the name page. Huntsmen taught them how to hunt, and priests taught them religion and academics. Pages were taught how to fight with wooden swords and lances, sometimes with the knights themselves, but mostly by practicing combat with other pages. When a page turned 14, he could become an esquire. In a religious ceremony, the new squire took a consecrated sword from a bishop or priest and swore to use it only for religious and honorable purposes. After the ceremony, the squire took his place in the lord's household and attended to his duties. There were different squires for specific duties. A squire could be assigned the duty of being a personal servant, or he could tend to the housekeeping of the castle. He could be what was known as the carving or table squire, who carved the meat or set up and tended to the banquet tables. A squire could be put in charge of the wine cellar or the pantry, or even cleaning and maintaining weapons and armor. A squire could also become a squire of honor and help the lord with ceremonies and feasts. During this period of squiring, the future knight learned to serve and master the intricacies of social behavior and chivalry. Squires also learned the martial arts of being a knight. They would keep up with the practice of sword fighting with wooden swords and lances, and were taught how to ride a horse while properly wielding a sword. A squire was expected to wear chainmail armor to get used to its heaviness and train in full battle armor, which was at least 80 pounds at times. Squires could also be seen next to the knight in battle and at tournaments, and taking care of the knight's armor and horses, as well as packing baggage. Finally, at the age of 21, a squire would be ready to be knighted if he had proven himself worthy of the title. Lord is a title for a person, almost always male, who had authority or power over others in his territory. The title Lord can also be used in respect to a religious deity. There are not many times in which Lord is an official title. However, in the Middle Ages during the feudal system, Lord of the Manor was often used to denote someone who was in control of land. A vassal is described as a person regarded as having a mutual obligation to his lord or monarch. These obligations often meant, quote, armed service and serving at court were not a vassal's only duties, giving financial aid was a requirement as well, end quote. A vassal provided mutual protection in exchange for certain privileges, usually including land held as a tenant or fief. The origin of the lord and vassal relationship began in England following the Norman conquest in 1066. Quote, all of the land in England was claimed by William the Conqueror and distributed amongst his Norman vassals as their reward for fighting for William. The vassals were well rewarded and left with their own land. The sections of land given to the loyal Norman vassals was called a fief. End quote. A fief was a grant of land made to a vassal. Vassals held political authority within this fief. The vassals owed allegiance to their king and his lord. Vassals were expected to pay for the land by providing the services to their immediate lord. This was called a feudal contract, which was an unwritten rule or understanding under feudalism that determined the relationship between a lord and his vassal. Many lords of the Middle Ages led the role of both vassal and lord simultaneously. This meant that they had control of a piece of land and leased some of that land. At the same time, the land they had control of was leased to them by a lord who was higher up in nobility, meaning that they were a vassal at the same time. Quote, the role of the vassals revolved around the oath of fealty sworn to his immediate superior, a great noble or even the king. End quote. In fact, in the feudal system, a majority of the nobility at the time were most likely in this type of situation because only the king was an ultimate power and a landowner. Most likely, the only way for a vassal to make money was by leasing his land to another vassal. Finally, at the bottom of the hierarchy is the third estate. The peasantry made up much of the population of Europe but held no political power. These were the laborers, the working class, the laboratores. Commonly, they were divided into two classes, freemen and serfs. The primary difference between these two classes was access to land. Freemen generally rented land from lords and had the freedom to come and go as they pleased. Serfs could not leave the land or manor without explicit permission from their lords. They were more commonly farmers and contributed much to the agricultural wealth of their lords. They paid taxes to their lords in the form of their trade in exchange for continued protection. The fees of the peasantry paid to the lords were in addition to the tithes demanded by the church. This kept the peasantry both impoverished and in fear. Ire from a lord could cost them their livelihood, and ire from the church, they believed, would cost them their souls. Their lives were hard, and they worked for the majority of the year. However, without the manual labor of the third estate, the entire feudal system would have fallen apart, and unrest among the peasantry did largely influence the eventual decline of feudalism in Europe.